Great. I'm Fiona, Godlee, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ. A wonderful presentation, and thanks, Harlan. Great discussion. It has, however, put us behind time. So with permission from someone in the room, Annette, I propose to carry on the session, in fairness to these four presenters, till 10 o'clock. I hope that's all right with everyone. So, innovations. We've just had a fantastic example of where the future may be, and we've got four great presentations this morning about innovations in peer review, and the first to come up is Simon Harris.
Thanks, Fiona. So yes, I'm going to talk to you today about a study we've been carrying out at IOP Publishing to assess author demand for double-blind peer review on some of our journals. So me and my co-authors all work for IOP Publishing, that's the Institute of Physics Publishing, which is based in the UK. I'm a managing editor there. And the impetus for this study really came from a debate about the future of peer review, which we had at an IOP Publishing conference last summer. I guess some of you might be wondering, what's the big deal about another study about demand for double-blind? It has been done before. So I guess at the start I want to emphasize that though double-blind review may be quite common in some areas, in some disciplines, perhaps in some biomedical areas, it's really not at all common in physics. So single-blind is very much the norm in physics and related disciplines, but we received feedback from some of our communities in support of double-blind, especially in the biophysics area, and this has prompted us to consider offering double-blind as an option on some of our journals to sort of assess the demand. We looked to do it on our Express journals, Materials Research Express and Biomedical Physics and Engineering, because they're relatively inclusive and international in their authorship. And some of the feedback we had was very much that there could be more demand for this option from authors from certain parts of the world who feel that double-blind is a fairer option. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that, of course, Nature have done some really pioneering studies of author demand for double-blind. And I think we heard a really interesting presentation on Sunday from them about their studies. I'd like to think that this work complements what Nature have done. We're looking to some extent at some different subject areas, and also we have some different measures in place. I hope you can guess what these images are meant to represent. It's not meant to be some kind of hostage situation or a blind date or anything like that. No. So the main goals of this study, the main goal really is to assess author demand for double-blind review in the subject areas of material science and biomedical physics and engineering. And specifically, we want to assess author preference by offering authors a choice of whether to submit double-blind or single-blind, and then measure the level of uptake, which is the percentage of direct submissions that are double-blind. We're also looking at the geographical trends, we'll get onto that in a minute, and we want to assess authors' perception of double-blind review and how satisfied they were with the double-blind process, and we've done that through an author survey. Finally, we've collected data to compare operational aspects of the peer review process between single-blind and double-blind. So we've got a referee survey set up. We've also looked at peer review times for each model and how it works for the journal staff. So in terms of the study design, we decided to go with a one-year pilot study for double-blind on those Express journals. I should stress that it's a pilot study. We wanted to collect some data and then make a sort of informed decision about whether to continue with double-blind or indeed whether to roll it out onto some of our other journals. And the way we went about setting this up was to set up a second submission and peer review site for each journal, so a double-blind site to go with the single-blind one. The reason we did it that way is I think it works more easily for reporting purposes to have the two sites. And if it turned out that there wasn't much demand for double-blind, it's easier to roll back to just offering single-blind. We put the onus on authors. Sorry, the authors are able to choose, obviously, whether to submit single-blind or double-blind. We very much put the onus on authors to anonymize their papers and gave them some guidelines for doing that. Although, as I think we heard yesterday, a lot of them don't seem to take much notice of guidelines. I think we all know that. So the one-year pilot was launched back in January, following sort of promotion for a month or two to the relevant communities. So this is what authors see when they come to submit to either of these journals. We point out to them that there's now a double-blind option on the journal, and that they're responsible, if they choose that, they're responsible for anonymizing their manuscript, and it points them to a checklist to help them do that. And then they've got the choice, they can click on either of those tabs, and it takes them to the relevant ScholarOne site. So we've done an analysis of the data 7 months in, specifically for this conference, so I should stress that these are kind of interim findings at this stage. The final analysis will be done after 12 months. The primary measure for us is the proportion of direct submissions to each journal that are submitted for double-blind review. And we set a significant uptake threshold at the start of the study, which was 10% double-blind uptake for MRX and 20% for BPEX. We thought the demand might be higher because it's in a biophysics area. We put surveys together at the final decision stage for submitting authors to measure satisfaction levels out of 10 with the double-blind process. And we also asked double-blind authors why they chose that option rather than single-blind. So on to the results. And in fact, the uptake on MRX, the materials journal, has been much higher than we expected. Just over 20% of direct submissions this year have been down the double-blind route. That's over 200 submissions to that journal. For BPEX, it's exactly 20% uptake, which is what we predicted. It's a slightly smaller journal. Geographical trends, we see significantly higher submission rates from Africa and from the Middle East for double-blind review. And the highest number of double-blind submissions were from India at 25%. There's actually quite a high rate, a similar rate for the single-blind site too. The rejection rate is significantly higher for double-blind review. It's about 20% higher than for single-blind, which I think is similar to what Nature have seen. And we've sort of drilled down a bit there and found that we do think we get more lower quality submissions for the double-blind site, judging from the lower distribution of referee scores. So as we've gone through the year, you can see here the total number of double-blind submissions to these journals has steadily increased, and we're now up to about 50 a month. So I guess as word has kind of got round that this is an option. In terms of the author survey, we've had 15 responses so far, and 14 of those authors rated their experience as a really positive one, at least 8 out of 10. And that's slightly more positive, actually, than we see in the single-blind survey. 13 out of the 15 respondents have said they chose the double-blind route because they think it's the fairest system of peer review. I guess that's no great surprise that they're saying that. We've just had 2 responses so far to the referee survey, and they were both quite positive. Neither of the referees were confident of being able to identify the authors, so that's pretty positive, because obviously that's an oft-made criticism of double-blind. We've also looked at the peer review times, and this has surprised us a bit. The times are actually, on average, slightly shorter for the double-blind submissions than for the single-blind submissions. So we've not encountered problems getting referees to accept for double-blind review, which has been really encouraging. So no real significant operational issues for us with this, apart from the occasional author kind of failing to anonymize their manuscript properly. And it's working fine for our journal staff. They're not spending significantly longer on double-blind articles, and they're okay working across the 2 sites. So in conclusion, I think our initial results suggest there is a significant demand from authors for double-blind review in these physics-related areas. The 20% uptake we're seeing so far is well, at least on target. It probably really exceeds our expectations. We think, if anything, this probably underestimates the demand for double-blind review, since it's obviously a voluntary option, and most authors, certainly in these fields, are not normally in the habit of anonymizing their manuscripts, so it's more work for them. So double-blind authors are reporting being highly satisfied with their experience of the process. And it's really, from an operational point of view, having the 2 peer review options is working fine for us. So finally, in terms of next steps, we'll do the final analysis and full report once the pilot has run its 12 months, so that will probably be in January of next year, and then decide whether to retain the double-blind option on these 2 journals, which I think is probably fair to say at this stage is looking likely, and whether to roll it out to other journals published by IOP, which I think is also looking likely. So finally, just to say, this is an area of peer review sort of experimentation that IOP Publishing is very much focused on at the moment. So we're certainly looking to have further kind of innovations, perhaps around open peer review. I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks, actually. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Questions at the back.
Hello, Irene Haynes. Double-blind peer review is getting much harder to actually operate and make it effective because of preprint servers. And obviously in physics, the culture is well established, lots of people submit. So did you actually look at the papers that chose double-blind peer review option? Had they actually been put on a preprint server at all?
No, we didn't. And I think this is a really good point, and it's definitely one of the potential drawbacks with it. What I will say is the journals we've chosen, the subject areas they're in, not very few submissions for these journals go onto the archive. But I agree this could be an issue for some of the more core physics journals where the archive's heavily used. So I think that's something we'll have to have a think about. Yeah,
obviously, if you roll it out to other of your journals, I think it's quite an important consideration.
It is, yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Rob Sievers, New Zealand. I have peer reviewed over many years articles under the double-blind peer review system, and in about 30–40% of the cases I've been able to identify the authors, you know, either through statements of, in a previous study we have shown that, and so on. In your instructions to the authors for the double-blind option, do you ask them to remove any of those comments?
We do, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's very much the author's responsibility. We accept that sometimes they're not going to blind their manuscript well enough, but at least, you know, that's 70% of cases where it is done blind. So, yeah.
Rennie, wherever. So, single-blind is an ancient tradition that we've established and take on, even though we now require papers to be signed and things. So it's very quaint indeed. So there's single-blind. Now you're trying double-blind, which quite a few people have done already. And the problems with double-blind, it's tedious, it's expensive, it can be broken. And where it's chiefly broken, the double-blind is, it's broken wrongly. Now, the big upset that people have against peer review is, or blinding peer review, is that junior people will be beaten around by senior people if they see their names come out, if it's open. And first of all, that's a perfectly disgraceful reason to adopt an unethical system, because an even worse unethical thing would happen. And secondly, it's been shown that most of the time when they guess wrong. Yeah. People say, I know so-and-so did it, and they didn't.
And your question is, Drummond?
Yes, and my question is, why on earth did you bother to do this study? It seemed to me that you should be doing open peer review. So I'd be really interested, why on earth did you do it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did it this way because single-blind, it might be an ancient tradition, but it's kind of served the physics community quite well. So we wanted to look at double-blind and just to trial it in the first instance rather than just mandating double-blind. In terms of open review, it's probably something we want to look at. But I think, again, some concerns about that in terms of possibly the rigour of the referee reports if their names are going to go with the papers. So I think that's something that I'm interested in hearing more about, and we will be looking at.
Randomised trials have been done. Over here, thank you.
Stuart Taylor from the Royal Society in London. It's not entirely clear to me what your objective here is, because you seem to just be looking at author preference, which in itself is not really a reason to change what you're doing. And the fact that authors like double-blind peer review, why is that a reason for doing it? Surely you need to look at whether it's more effective or better in some way. I mean, you've said it's associated with slightly worse submissions, so it seems puzzling to me that, you know, I'm not sure what you're trying to do.
Well, I think part of our mission as a publisher is to offer a service to our authors. So if there's a big section of the community who feel that they're not getting a fair service through the ancient traditional system, then we're interested in offering a different option to them. So that was the main aim of the study, is to see whether there is demand and whether it works okay. And it seems the answer to both those points is yes.
Thank you.
Nicola Nugent, Royal Society of Chemistry. Thanks for a nice talk. I'm just going back to the first question from Irene about anonymizing manuscripts and how difficult that can be. Did you do any checks on whether the authors did actually anonymize their manuscripts fully in terms of the content and associated files and that sort of thing? And was that something that you were able to measure? And secondly, were you able to measure any impact on the peer review outcomes, which I guess relates to the question previously?
Yeah, so we do kind of screen the manuscripts when they come in, certainly at a high level, to make sure that the authors aren't revealing their names. We didn't go to the extent of reading through the whole paper and seeing whether they inadvertently gave themselves away. In terms of the levels of failing to anonymize the manuscript, it was quite high to begin with, probably approaching 50% right at the start. But then we added an extra point on the submission form just to really drill home to authors that you need to, before you submit, you need to have anonymized your manuscript, and it's now very low levels of, or quite low levels of failure to anonymize. What was the second point?
Sorry, the second question was just about whether you were able to measure any impact on the peer review outcomes, so whether the paper was accepted or rejected.
No, we haven't done that yet.
3 more brief questions, yeah.
Melissa Vaught, Bethesda, Maryland. One of my concerns here about comparing these differences in rejection rates between double-blind and single-blind peer review is that you may actually be penalizing these authors for opting into double-blind peer review. I mean, there's at least one report that has indicated that reviewers score publications more harshly when they're blinded to the names of those authors. But basically what you're saying here is you're saying these are lower quality publications because the reviewer scored them more poorly. So how do you address that issue to make sure that this isn't just some sort of bias among authors for basically what do these authors have to hide for opting into double-blind?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It is possible that the referees are demonstrating some kind of bias there. But I think the point was to give the authors the choice. They don't have to submit down the double-blind route. If they do feel that they're going to get a harder deal that way, then they can submit down the single-blind route. So it's all about offering choice, really.
Well, right, but I wonder how many authors are really aware of that sort of bias in the system that might be present in the system, and so that they may not realize that they're actually sort of opting into a more biased route.
Thanks.
Theo Bloom from BMJ, but with a question that's come via Twitter, and for the person categorising questions, that's from Emily F on Twitter. Why are submissions for double-blind review of lower quality? What's the social context that influences that? I mean, do you have a theory on why, taking what Melissa said, they may not be of lower quality, but if they are, why is that happening?
It's hard to say. I guess it may be encouraging submissions from areas that the research isn't quite as developed or doesn't have as much funding. I mean, the data's there to see, and I think you can interpret it however you want, really. I don't want to try and draw conclusions.
Thank you. Final question.
Yeah, I mean, you got some flack for saying we did this because it's service to authors, and, I understand both sides of that argument. But I hope that lots of us in this room really care about the fact that people in low and middle income countries, often doing very good research, do really struggle to get it published. And that's partly because our journals don't have nearly enough reviewers from those countries, and we should all be bending over backwards to try and find the best reviewers in those regions, and then we might help to solve the real problem. Sorry, that was a comment.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
A comment to end on. Thank you very much, and thank you, Simon.
Thank you.